Where are you from? Malaysia. You don't look Malaysian. Where are you really from? Okay, I'm from India. So then why did you say you were Malaysian? Why didn't you just tell me where you're originally from? Also, how's your English so good? What was that little monologue I just did there? That's basically what a TCK goes through every time you ask them where they're from. What is a TCK? A TCK is a third culture kid. A third culture kid is someone who is born in one country but is raised up in another. Why three cultures? Why that weird arbitrary number? Your first culture is the culture where your parents come from or the passport you hold, assuming that your parents are from the same culture, of course. Your second culture is the culture you grow up in. Your third culture is the culture that you negotiate as a result of being in your first and your second culture. Now, every TCK has a different TCK experience, but we'll get into that a little later. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Abeer Yusuf, and that's not a spelling mistake. It does not mean alcohol by any measure of the name. It actually means fragrance in Arabic. And I'm I'm not from India, again, sorry. I was born in India, but I was raised in the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and most significantly in Malaysia. If you ever go into my Facebook profile, you'll see that I have not filled out where I'm currently located or where I'm actually from, because that gives me a serious sweat issue whenever I think about it. Whenever I have to fill out a form, I literally have an identity crisis, and this is not even a joke. The reason is because I have 5 addresses to choose from, 5 addresses in the whole world. But if you were to ask me, okay, Abeer, where do you feel most at home? It's not going to be any one of those 5 addresses. Where I feel most at home is actually Changi Airport. That is in Singapore. I don't even live in Singapore. But the reason why it's the place that I feel most at home at is because that's where I used to fly out of all the time when I was a kid. Beyond that, let's talk about why you care about where I feel at home or where I don't feel at home. It doesn't matter to most of you, but it matters to me. And the question I want to ask you is, how do you know where you're from? How do you know where home is or what your identity is? I think home matters. I think identity matters. It matters that you know where you're from so that you know what your place in the world is. Think about it for a minute. What makes you Canadian? What makes you American? What makes you different to the other person? What makes you not Mauritian or not Indian? It's knowing your identity. It's knowing your place in the world. It's where you've grown up, the people you've grown up with. And that's my basic point. That's what we're going to be talking about today, about what identity really means and what it feels like when you don't have one, because that's essentially what TCKs are. People that don't have identities, that are constantly fused in this place of not knowing what is home, what is not home. When you go home today, I hope you think about identity. I hope you think about whether it matters that you know where you're from, what your place is, and how you understand and see the world. Because each one of you sitting here today understands the world because of the way you've been brought up, because of where your home is, and because of the people you've grown up with. But TCKs matter for another reason. Think about globalization for a minute. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the word globalization? The fact that you can buy bananas all year round, the fact that you can catch the next flight to Polynesia whenever your heart so desires, or the fact that you can just walk down the road and you can eat all the world's cuisines. But we need to start thinking about globalization in terms of people. And my point is that you need to start thinking about globalization in terms of people like me. I am the most visible byproduct of globalization. In 2007, it was estimated that there are about 4 million TCKs, give or take. We don't even know what the current numbers are because there's such a mobile group. And, right now we're just the exception, but soon we're going to become the norm. And that's when it'll start mattering. That's when it'll start becoming important. Ruth Reekin, who's an academic who's done a lot of work on TCK literature, says that people like us are basically the model citizens of a globalized world. the perfect candidates for navigating a universe that is constantly converging, that is constantly changing, and that is constantly reinventing itself and connecting us like never before. But are we really? Here's what happens when you're at TCK. It's true, you do get a lot more cultural sensitivity. You do understand a lot more about other people. For example, I know that if I'm going into a South Indian person's home to ask if I should wash my feet before I enter the house because they have certain ideas around things like that. I know that if I'm going to meet someone who's from Japan, I need to make sure, absolutely make sure, that I'm not going to be late to see them. The obvious perk is that you learn how to swear in lots of languages. For example, culo. I learned that that means ass in Spanish. Or bodoh in Malay, which means stupid. So these are just obviously some of the bad words, I know. I can tell you more afterwards. You get to really travel a lot, and you develop this real thirst for travel, this wanderlust. But the unfortunate factor of that is also that you can't seem to ground yourself anywhere. You're no longer stable. A friend of mine is constantly moving. Every 2 years, he changes where he's going and constantly is just like upping and going. And every time he moves, he says, you know what, Abeer, no, this is it. I've just found my people. This is it. This is happening. And 1 year later, he'll be like, yeah, actually, you know what? No, I'm just like got tired of the place. I gotta go. I gotta get out of here. Like, okay. Now, another thing is that you'll end up as a TCK making lots of relationships, lots of friends, and connecting really quickly, relating to others so fast. But the downside of that is that research shows that TCKs actually have a really hard time committing to relationships and being in relationships. The reason is because the main logic that TCKs go through is, why should I commit to a relationship when I have to leave in 2 years anyway? Makes sense, right? Yet another example is that you develop a wealth of knowledge, a lot of trivia about people, about places, lots of things that help you intimately know something. For example, you know where to get the best tandoori chicken in Bombay. You know the best place to go for pad thai in Bangkok. Sorry, all of my examples are food related, but it's just something I personally like. But the unfortunate thing is that if you go up for a job interview, you may not get selected. An employer would want to choose someone who's a local, who's born and brought up there, because they have a local context. They have an understanding of the history of the place, of the socioeconomic context, of things of that sort, which will leave you at a disadvantage. And that doesn't feel very nice. I'll give you one last example. When I was a kid and I used to go to India for my school holidays back home in December, I would meet my cousins, and my cousins, when talking and having conversations with other people, would say, oh, this is our cousin, she's come from Malaysia, that's where she's from. I'd be like, okay, great. When I'd go back to Malaysia and start my school term, all of my friends would tell other people, oh, she's from India, she's only here to study. It's the worst feeling in the world. Really, okay, it's not the worst feeling in the world. The worst feeling in the world is damp, moist socks. It's the second worst feeling in the world to know that both these places that you consider your home don't feel the same way back. And it can really affect your mentality and the way you look at the world. Which is why I like to think of being a TCK, as a privileged statelessness. It's really good because you get to have all these great experiences. You get all these great stories about the time you were in a haunted hotel in Ho Chi Minh, or how when you went to the bathroom in Bangalore, you found out after doing your big business that there's no paper or water. But it's also unfortunate not because, well, you don't have toilet water or paper, but it's unfortunate because you also constantly feel like you don't belong. It's a bit like feeling like Voldemort, with pieces of his soul that are, all apart, and they can't ever be a whole. Yeah, that's pretty much what it feels like. Now, we talked a lot about common TCK experiences, but does this mean that if you've already identified that an individual is a TCK, that's the end of it? That's okay, we can move on from there. Now they're a TCK. What's so different about them? Here's the interesting thing. Just because two people identify as TCK and they may have all these experiences that I just shared with you in common, it does not mean that they're going to come to the same conclusions about the same issues. Let me give you an example. And it's going to be a big example because it's a big point that we're going to talk about. It's about home. I did my first master's thesis in cultural studies at Monash University, Malaysia. And I basically looked at South Asian third culture kids and how they negotiate identity. Convenient because I was navel gazing. And I basically looked at 10 individuals, 10 such individuals, 5 male, 5 female, all young adults. They had in common their trajectories, their home environments, their countries, their schooling patterns, their name it, they had it in common. They had lots of things in common. Yet for the life of me, I could not find a single pattern that I could tell you applied to all of them, to all 10 of them. I looked at them through a gendered lens. I looked at them and their identity through an individualist versus a collectivist lens. I looked at them through a peer network. I looked at everything you can possibly imagine I could use from the academic world. Yet I cannot give you one single example of something that applies to all 10 of them across the board. And that's when I realized that there is no such categorization that you can apply to a TCK apart from the fact that they're a TCK. Funny story, 4 of them didn't even know that they were TCKs. And I was like, okay, well, probably should read up on that. And they did, and they thought that it was great. Now, before I go into about home and about these kind of conversations that we had, I want to address a question that some of you might probably have in the audience. What makes a TCK different to a Chinese immigrant who's based in the USA or a diasporic Indian from the United States? Here's the difference. 2 words, expected repatriation. Expected repatriation is what makes all the difference when we're talking about TCKs, mainly because it's how you view home. Expected repatriation means that at some point a TCK is expected to go back to their home of first culture. That means that there is an expectation that they will finish their journey in their second culture and return to that first culture of their parents. In some cases, it doesn't happen. In countries that give you that kind of opportunities where you can, stabilize yourself, where you can sort of integrate and acculturate, it happens. You get to stay back in those countries of second cultures. But in some countries, you don't get to do that. And more so now, when a lot of countries are tightening up their borders and they are, creating like protectionist policies around immigration, it happens where you have to go back to your first culture or choose another country to embark upon. But that's essentially what happens when we're talking about identity and how that becomes different to an immigrant experience. Expected repatriation is the reason why home becomes a very contentious issue for third culture kids. So when I interviewed lots of these 10 individuals, I asked them the same question, where do you think home is? One said, it's my second culture. No matter what I do, I did grow up in my second culture. I can't alienate itself from who I am and my identity. It's home for me and it'll always be. A second student said, no, my home is my first culture. Even though I've never lived there, it is my home because the second culture that they were talking about was a country that didn't want to keep that person, had barriers to employment and so on. And that person said that, why should I consider this country my home when it's not giving me the chance to live there, to be a part of its good, its bad, its ugly? Why should I say that I'm from that country? Might as well say that I'm from the first culture. Then there's that sad, depressing group that thinks that they're from nowhere. They don't identify with their first culture, they don't identify with their second culture. There are other people that I've met who say that home is where they are currently located because that's where they are right now, and it's physically where their home is, right? There's some who find home within themselves. And one time I had this conversation with a self-identified TCK who told me, yeah, I'm from here, I'm from this place and that place. And I was like, oh, okay, so where do you consider home? And he said, Oman. And I'm like, oh, that's great. How long have you been there? He goes, about 3 months. And I'm like, great, how do you like it there? And he goes, well, I don't really know, I haven't been there. And I asked him, okay, then how do you think it's home? Turns out that for this guy, home was basically where his parents were. And his parents had recently moved to Oman, and he hadn't had the chance to go back and meet them. So from this, we understand that no two TCKs have the same answer about any one particular thing. I asked you earlier about identity. I asked you to think about identity. I ask you this question again. Think about it, but this time, think about it in a globalized context. We need to look at identity and consider it as this moving project in a world that is constantly moving, not stopping. I want you to consider this debate about identity because we live in a globalized world. It is important to think about this because it affects each and every one of you, whether or not you're a TCK. I should be the perfect candidate for this world. I should be winning at every race. I should be succeeding in every marathon I take part in. But I'm not. I'm stuck. I'm emotionally stuck. And I'm wondering about identity. And I'm wondering if my life would be better, if I would be way better off if I was a monocultural kid who had all the proper job opportunities to apply and hold the job because I was from one country. But don't feel too sorry for me because I get to stand up here and talk to you guys for 20 minutes about this. We talk about many things in a global context. Political theorists, popular commentators all talk about how we need to stop seeing ourselves as part of nations, as parts of states. We need to start seeing humanity as a whole, as sort of like people that are just in this one big giant blob. We need to start recognizing that states are redundant. But my question is that really so? Should we? Should we do that? Should we imagine that? You and I, for example, we're both laughing at the same BuzzFeed listicle about 10 GIFs that describe your face at a TED Talk, going, number 7, dude, it's totally you and me. We're both thinking about, how pathetic it is that Breaking Bad is over now. And we're both wondering about how Calvin is such a god, Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, obviously. So we have a lot of these cultural points that we can converge on, that we can agree on, because of the way that our world is structured right now. We're so homogenous in the ways our identities are structured. The United States of the internet is real. But does that mean that we're done being individuals? Does that mean that identity no longer needs to be delineated by nations and states and borders? I argue no. It matters. It matters because I'm part of that. I'm part of that product. I'm supposed to be the winner in that game of being global, but I'm not winning. I'm stuck. I belong, yet I'm an outsider at the same time. And this should matter to you. This should matter to you because, fun fact, 3 of the 8 speakers today are actually TCKs. And they're going to come to get you. Soon, you're either going to be dating a TCK, you're going to be married to a TCK, and it is more than likely that you're going to be a parent to a TCK. Here's the thing. It doesn't matter if you're a TCK or not. We all have our journeys, we all have our stories, we all have our experiences. What matters the most is that at the end of the day, you get to come back home. But if you don't have a home, where do you go? That's why identity matters. Home matters. Thank you.